Well, welcome to chapter 14. And in chapter 14, we're going to be learning about the relative pronoun. This is a relatively easy chapter. The relative pronoun in Greek functions a lot like it does in English. So there's not going to be a whole lot of surprises here. And it's a simple 2-on-2 form, so it's not a real difficult chapter. In fact, the fog should be getting lighter. There shouldn't be a whole lot of it for you right now. But there's actually something else in chapter 14 that's really important, and that's this. Chapter 14 is the final chapter in the entire noun system. When you're done with chapter 14, you're going to know all the Greek and English grammar you need for nouns, for adjectives, for pronouns, that whole part of the grammar system. So that's really good. Whether you're on track 1 or track 2, you're now going to be done with the noun system. So congratulations on that. But let me give you a warning at the same time. Verbs start in chapter 15. One of the things that students historically have troubles with is switching back and forth between nouns and verbs. And you'll look at a verb and you'll want to give it case. Well, verbs don't have case, you're going to find out. And the trouble is some people can mix the noun and the verb system. And that's why I kept nouns and verbs so separate in BBG. I just found it to be a lot easier way to do things. But here's the best advice I can give you for not mixing up your nouns and your verbs. Get caught up. All right? The better you know the noun system, the less the chances of confusing it with the verbal system. All right? So if you really are up in your nouns and your adjectives and your cases and all that kind of stuff, when you get to verbs, it'll be easier to say, okay, verbs are totally different than nouns, and I'm not going to confuse the two. But if you're struggling with pronouns, if you're struggling with autos, especially if you're still struggling with cases, in which case you're in real trouble. If you're having struggles with those, then it's harder to move into verbs. So please, do chapter 14, get all caught up, make sure you're caught up on all of your noun grammar. Because then when we hit chapter 15 of verbs, you'll find it to be not that big of a deal. Okay? Okay. So what are relative pronouns? Well, there's technical ways you can describe a relative pronoun, but they get pretty complicated. And so over the years, I just found it easier to say this. The relative pronouns in English are the words who, that, and which. And then who also occurs in the forms of whose and whom. Okay? So the relative pronouns in English are the words who, that, and which. And usage of the relative pronouns really differ from person to person. And there are some general guidelines, but some of them are not very hard and fast. Just a lot of it is whatever you're comfortable with. All right, but in terms of generally how do we use relative pronouns, these are the guidelines. We tend to use who when the antecedent is personal. Okay, when we're referring back to a man or a woman, or a masculine or a feminine person, we tend to use the word who. And so if you were to say something like, the teacher whom the students love teaches Greek, obviously. Okay, the teacher whom, why do we choose whom? Well, whom's just a form of who. Well, what's its antecedent? The antecedent is teacher. The teacher is going to be a man or a woman. So we tend to say the teacher whom the students love, because it's going back to a personal antecedent. So who in its different forms tends to be used with personal antecedents. It's really interesting. Whose, which is a form of whom, whose can also be used of inanimate objects as well, in ways that who can't. For example, I sold the car whose color made me ill. I probably wouldn't say that, but I sold the car whose color made me ill. Whose is going back to an inanimate object, to the car, but we can get away with doing that in English. So who tends to refer to people and whom. Whose can go back to inanimate. When you go to the other relative pronouns, which tends to be used of inanimate objects, but not always, and that can be used with any gender. So the relative pronoun is pretty flexible. Who tends to be used with personal antecedents, whose and which can be used with inanimate, and then that can be used with any of them, okay? Now, relative pronouns are not interrogatives, okay? You can use the words in English, who, whose, and which, to ask a question. In that case, they're classified as interrogatives. They're not relative pronouns. Now, you already know the Greek word for asking a question, right? The Greek interrogative is tis, with the accent, and that's how we ask the who question. But in English, when we use who, which, or whose, and we're asking a question, that's not the interrogative. That's not the relative. It's the interrogative. Otherwise, it is the relative. So that's the one qualification. Let's talk a bit about relative clauses. So I'm almost done with this upfront grammar. A relative clause is a clause. That means a verb's going to be in it. But a relative clause is a clause where the first word is a relative pronoun. So Jesus says, come to me, whoever is thirsty, and I will give you something to drink. Now, whoever is technically the indefinite relative, but I'll use it for the illustration. Come to me, whoever is thirsty. Okay, whoever is thirsty is the relative clause. It's introduced with a relative pronoun, who, or in this case, whoever, and then it's got a verb, and it's got some other words. Okay, so that's the relative clause. It's really important with relative clauses that you identify the beginning and the end. Now, the beginning is really easy. It's going to be the relative pronoun. And in terms of finding the end of a relative clause, you can generally put a comma there. And if you can put a comma there and it makes sense, that's the chance that that's the full relative clause. In fact, if the relative clause is modifying something, you can actually pull the relative clause out of the sentence and say, does the sentence still make sense? And if it does, there's a chance that you correctly identified the end of the relative clause. So, come to me, whoever is thirsty, and I will give you something to drink. Come to me and I will give you drink. That makes sense. Okay, that probably is the beginning and the ending of the relative clause. So a relative clause is a clause where the first word is a relative pronoun. It's going to have a verb, and it could have other modifiers as well. Now, a relative pronoun will do, or I should say a relative clause will do one of two things. It can modify something else, such as in the previous example. And when a relative clause is modifying something, it's really simple to translate. You're going to see it in Greek, and you'll just be able to translate. It won't be a problem at all. You would say, come to me, and then you would have your relative clause and whatnot. It'll be simple. Don't worry about it. When a relative clause, though, is functioning as something, it can be a little harder to translate. And the trick is to understand that when a relative clause is functioning as something, when you put your hands around the beginning and the end of it, that's a noun idea. In fact, I remember in learning Greek, I used to put dashes between the words that made up the relative clause because I wanted to think of the relative clause as a unit of meaning. And once I recognized that it was a unit of meaning, I would ask myself, well, what's it functioning as? And then it was easy to translate. For example, whoever is not against me is for me. I use another indefinite relative, but it still works. Whoever is not against me is for me. Okay, one of Jesus' sayings. Okay, the relative pronoun is whoever. Where's the end of the relative clause? Now, see, what does it take to make a unit of thought, a dependent unit of thought, but a unit of thought nonetheless? Well, it's whoever is not against me, comma, not correct English, but you do it to help understand the clause. Whoever is not against me, comma, is for me. So whoever is the relative pronoun, whoever is not against me is the entire relative clause. What's it functioning as? What's it doing? Well, the main verb in the sentences is. So if you put dashes between the words or put quote marks around the relative clause, whoever is not against me, what's its function in the sentence? Well, it's the subject, isn't it? Whoever is not against me, that person is for me. Okay, see how it works? So relative clause is very straightforward. Introduced with a relative pronoun, there'll be a verb and perhaps other words. They can modify another noun, in which case they're easy to translate, or they can function as something, the subject, the direct object, the object, or the preposition. And the key there is just to view the relative clause as a unit and ask what function is that particular unit working, defining. Okay? All right. Well, let's go ahead and look at the forms of the Greek relative pronoun. The forms that you're going to memorize are hos, he, ha, the lexical forms, the forms that mean who or which or that. And you go into the genitive singular, and it's who, heis, who. In the dative, ho, he, ho, and in the accusative, han, hain, ha. Okay, there's a couple of patterns here. What do these things look like? I mean, they're pretty straightforward in their patterns. Well, people have learned them two different ways, or at least identify them two different ways. On one hand, they could be the case endings preceded by the final stem vowel of the declension with a rough breathing and accent. For other people, they think of them as the definite article with a tau replaced with a rough breathing. So whether you use the article analogy or the final stem vowel plus case ending analogy, you can see how simple the relative pronouns are to memorize. But notice they always have a rough breathing and they always have an accent. When you switch into the plural, you have hoi, hi, ha, and then everything else is as you would expect. Now, what's tricky about the hoi and the hi is they look just like the definite article, don't they? Except that there's an accent. Remember, when these forms are the definite article, there's no accent. But in the case of the relative pronouns, they always have a rough breathing and they always have an accent. And after that, the forms are very straightforward. Again, this may be one of those paradigms that you just want to memorize. They're so common and they're so easy to know. Okay, enough of paradigms. What would determine which of those forms in the paradigm a Greek writer or speaker would use in a sentence? What determines their form? Well, what determines the form of any pronoun? Again, relative pronouns are pronouns, and so just bring back your pronoun grammar. It's pretty straightforward. What determines the number and gender of a pronoun? It's antecedent, right? So when the Greeks were getting ready to say a relative pronoun, they would think back to the antecedent. They would think about what's that antecedent's gender, what's that number, and then they would choose the right form of hos, okay? So gender and number of a relative pronoun are determined by antecedent. Well, what determines the case of a relative pronoun? What determines the case of any pronoun? Well, it's function, right? Okay, here's a little twist with relative pronouns. The case of a relative pronoun is determined by its function. But the case of the relative pronoun is determined by its function inside the relative clause. Okay, so how it may appear to be functioning outside the clause is irrelevant. But the case that is going to be used for the relative pronoun is determined by how it's used inside the relative clause. Okay? Now, let me give you a couple of examples. And again, pretend these examples are in Greek. If you saw a sentence, the woman whom we saw was walking to the subway. I know, I think it's stupid illustrations, I'm sorry. But anyway, the woman whom we saw was walking to the subway. Okay, what's the relative clause? Well, the clause is whom we saw, right? Whom is the relative pronoun. If you pull it out, it still makes sense. The woman was walking to the subway. But whom we saw is the relative clause. So it's like you got to kind of pull it out and put blinders around, so you're looking just at the relative clause. And you're saying, what is the function of whom inside the relative clause? Well, the verb is saw, so we is the subject, so we saw whom? Well, we saw the woman. Oh, and see, that's the trick. If you get stuck on this, replace the relative pronoun with its antecedent, okay? Whom we saw, woman we saw woman. Oh, we saw woman. So woman inside the relative clause would be the direct object. And so we're going to use the accusative form of the relative pronoun to refer back, okay? The woman whom we saw. Now, what will be kind of weird in a sentence like this is that woman is going to be in the nominative because it's the subject. And then right next to it is going to be a relative pronoun referring back to it, but it's going to be an accusative. So if it were an adjective, it would have to be nominative, right, to agree. But it's not an adjective. It's a relative pronoun. Its case is determined by its function inside the relative clause. Inside the relative clause, it's the direct object. So it would be hegune in the nominative, and then the relative pronoun is going to be in the accusative. Okay. So for pronouns, gender and number by antecedent, case by its function inside the relative clause. Okay, good. The star that they had seen led them to Jesus. Okay, the relative clause is that they had seen. What's its function inside the relative clause? They had seen the star. They had seen that they had seen. That is going to be in the accusative because it's the direct object of the verb inside the relative clause. Okay, so that's how they determine what form of the paradigm to use. Gender and number by antecedent, case by its function, but its function inside the relative clause. Okay, good. Okay, how do relative clauses function? Well, let me put it another way. How do you find them used in a sentence? Well, one of two ways. One way is they're modifying something, and these are really straightforward. You'll just read them, and they'll read very naturally from Greek into English. The man, relative pronoun, who is sitting at the table is my pastor. You'd say ha-aner or ha-anthropos, the man, and then who is sitting. Okay, now in this relative clause, what case is who going to be? Okay, think about it. Little review, okay? The man who is sitting at the table is my pastor. Okay, the relative clause is who is sitting at the table. Who is the subject, right? All right. So it's who is sitting. The man is sitting. Who is sitting? So in this case, you would have ha-aner or ha-anthropos, nominative singular masculine, and then the relative pronoun in this case would be nominative singular masculine. Not because its case is not because it's modifying man, it's like as if it were an adjective, but because man is the antecedent, and that determines the masculine singular. Who is sitting at the table, the who is functioning as a subject inside the relative clause. Okay, enough for review. In these cases, these things, when the relative clause is modifying something, they're very straightforward, not a problem. It may be a little harder when the relative clause is functioning as something, whether it's a subject or a direct object or an object of a preposition, but just think about it. Think grammatically what's going on, and it's pretty straightforward. You may have to add in some words to kind of make sense when the relative clause is functioning as something, but it's going to be easy. For example, if you saw a sentence in Greek that was something like, who takes up his cross is my disciple. Well, if you just said, who takes up his cross, that sounds like an interrogative, right? You can't do it that way. But rather you would add some words in, something like, he who, or the one who, or the person who, or for feminine, the woman who takes up his or her cross is, my disciple or something. So when a relative pronoun, a relative clause is functioning as something, you may have to add in some extra words, but it's very straightforward and it shouldn't cause you any real trouble. Okay, some few final words on how you translate these things. And again, I've covered most of these, so this is more of a review. You got to keep your relative clause together, okay? Find the relative pronoun, find the end of the clause, put your hands around it, kind of view it as a substantive idea or an adjectival idea, but you got to keep the clause together, okay? If it helps, put a comma at the end of the relative clause to help you do that. It might be that if it's a really long relative clause, you may need to kind of view it almost like a sentence. It won't be because it's a dependent construction. but you may need to kind of view it as a separate sentence and then find the verb and then find what else there is. Is there a subject? Is there a direct object? Are there other modifiers? And kind of break the relative clause up as if it were a sentence. But you may have to do that if it's a really long relative clause. And remember, too, when it comes to translation, that relative clauses are always dependent constructions, okay? They will have a verb, but it'll never be the main verb in the sentence. All right, so much for translations. So what have we learned in chapter 14? Well, the relative pronoun is has, he, ha. It's a 2-1-2 form. No real big surprises. It looks like the article that's been where the towel's been replaced with a rough breathing, or it looks like a final stem vowel and a rough breathing with a case ending. Whatever works for you. They always have rough breathings and accents, though. The case of a relative pronoun is determined by its function inside the relative clause, gender, number by antecedent, as you would expect. Relative pronouns will introduce a relative clause, and that clause will either be modifying something or it'll be functioning as something, a subject, a direct object, an object of a preposition. They're always dependent constructions. They can never stand on their own. Okay, very good. That's it for chapter 14, and that's it for the entire noun system. But before you jump into the vocabulary, let me just point out two things in this vocabulary section. One's kind of weird, and one's really helpful, okay? There is a vocabulary form in this exercise, hadas, omicron with a rough breathing, delta omicron sigma. And he's going to show it as hadas u. So it looks just like logos u, but the article is he. And at first glance, it may look like I made a mistake, but I didn't. This word is feminine. It's not hadas u ha, it's hadas u he. Okay, remember the rules on declensions. They weren't primarily gender-based, were they? Stems ending in alpha or eta are first declension, stems ending in omicron are second. And we learned that most second declension nouns are masculine. There are some second declension neuters whose lexical forms end in on, but they're not exclusively masculine or neuter. There are second declension feminine words. Not a ton of them, but there are some, and this is one of them. So hadas is going to look just like logos, but it's feminine, which means the article and anything else modifying it is going to be feminine, okay? This is just one of the sub-patterns in the second declension that you need to learn, okay? So that's it for hadas. The other thing that's really cool in this chapter is that look at the end of the vocabulary. When you're done learning this vocabulary, you're going to learn, you will know a fraction more than 2/3 of all the word occurrences in the New Testament. Congratulations! Just a little over 66.6, but you are over that landmark. So if you're not doing it by now, you should have a Greek Testament. You should be able to scan it. And even if you don't know the vocabulary, you'll know the forms, the case settings, and it's real encouraging. This is the last major milestone until the last couple of chapters in the book when it comes to vocabulary. So you will now know 2/3 of all word occurrences. So congratulations. So, okay, memorize your words and do your homework and get caught up.
Aletheia, aletheus, hey. Truth. Eirene, erenes, hey. Peace. Enopion, with the genitive before. Epangelia, epangelius, hey. Promise. Hepta, 7. Thranos, thranu, ha. Throne. Jerusalem, hey. Jerusalem. Kata, with the genitive down from, against, with the accusative according to, throughout, during. Kephale, kephales, hey. Head. hadas, hadu, hey. Way, road, journey, conduct. Has, hey, ha. Who or whom, which. Hate, when. Hutos, thus, so, in this manner. Ploion, ployu, ta. Ship, boat. Herema, herematas, ta. Word, saying. Te. And so, so. Cher, cheras, hey. Hand, arm, finger. Psuche, psuches, hey. Soul, life, self.